President-elect Trump said he'll pull out of the Paris Agreement. And I believe him. He's got a track record of doing what he says he's gonna. And in a video that was shared on NBC News in October of 2024, right before the election, he said, we're going to do it again because it's a ripoff. Check out this video clip.
If you are elected, will you pull the U.S. out of the Paris Accord on climate change once again?
Well, we're going to do it again because it's a ripoff. We pay $1 trillion. Other countries pay nothing. China pays nothing. India pays nothing. Russia pays nothing. And we pay $1 trillion at least. And we'll take them out so fast your head would spin. It's a ridiculous one-sided deal. All they did with the Paris Accord is take advantage environmentally of the United States, and we're not going to stand for it.
Quick fact check, and I'll put my sources in the description of the video. The U.S. pays $1 trillion for climate change. False. 11.4 billion. China pays nothing. False. According to the Chinese government, they pay 24.5 billion. India pays nothing. False. They pay 1.28 billion. Russia pays nothing. True. According to the Climate Action Tracker, they do not make any substantial contributions. So when I first heard President-elect Trump say he's going to pull out of the Paris Agreement, I was like, oh, crap. What now? But the more I looked into it, it seems like the Paris Agreement may not actually be working, and it might be focused on the wrong thing. Where did this Paris Agreement come from anyways? Okay, serious throwback here. December 1983. That's 41 years ago from the time I'm recording this video. I was in grade 11. Every Breath You Take by the Police was the #1 Billboard song. And the United Nations commissioned the Brundtland Commission to look into environmental challenges. Took them 4 years to do the report, and it was published in 1987 with the groundbreaking concept of sustainable development, which they defined as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. You can download the report from the link in the video's description. The report highlighted critical global environmental challenges and the interconnectedness of the economy, environment, and society. It also made clear that many of these environmental challenges are global in scale, and global challenges require a global response. So 5 years later, at the 1992 Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, this thing called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, we'll call it UNFCCC, was agreed to by 154 states with an objective of stabilizing greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere to prevent dangerous human interference with the climate system. 30 years ago, the world had already agreed to work together to prevent dangerous human interference with the climate system. That's a throwback. So this work then led to the Kyoto Protocol, which started in 1997 and ran to 2020, where industrialized countries agreed to reduce their emissions. And this did achieve some success in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Developed countries actually achieved an average annual emissions reduction of 22% compared to their 1990 levels. And that paved the way for further effort, which came in the form of the Paris Agreement in 2015, where 195 countries signed on, including the United States of America, to do three things primarily. Limit global temperature rise to well below 2 degrees C compared with pre-industrial. Preferably limit that increase to just 1.5 degrees Celsius. And it required all parties who signed on to report their emissions annually. Sidebar here, the United States has been in and out of this agreement. So President Obama signed the US in 2016. President Trump withdrew in 2017. President Biden rejoined in 2021. Okay, so we've got these agreements. How's it going? Is it working? So far, global greenhouse gas emissions have continued to grow. In fact, between 2015 and 2018, annual carbon dioxide emissions increased by 1 billion tons. That's billion with a B. That's a big number. That's 1,000 million. That's like 25 million flights on a 737, a Boeing 737, from Los Angeles to New York. Still, I can't visualize that. Real-world visuals made a simulation to give us an idea of what carbon emissions look like since greenhouse gases are invisible. Check out this video they shared under the Creative Commons.
This is the actual rate we're adding greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere today. More than 1,000 tons a second. 1 million tons every 13 minutes. 112 million tons a day. You get the picture.
Okay, now that video was from 2019, okay? That's 5 years ago. And our emissions have not gone down. They've gone up. And what's more, the current national pledges that have been made are insufficient to meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. And not all countries are making even ambitious or credible commitments. And the OECD countries have been criticized for inadequate action. Now, according to the World Meteorological Organization's June 2024 report, there's an 80% likelihood of at least 1 year temporarily exceeding the 1.5 degrees Celsius level between 2024 and 2028. Okay? An 80% likelihood of at least one of those next 4 years exceeding the 1.5 degrees C increase. What does that translate to? We've already achieved 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial conditions. Yay us! We're already there. We seem stuck on continuing with this business as usual system that hasn't been working. So November 24, 2024, at COP29, geez, a lot of 20s there, a new goal was set for developed countries to give undeveloped countries $300 billion annually, okay, every year, by 2035 to help them adapt to climate change, to protect their populations from escalating climate impacts, and help them, not the industrialized countries, but them, transition to low carbon economies. Is this really going to work? Are we focused on the wrong thing? Here's the thing about that goal. This is a plan to keep emitting. Yes, we intend to reduce our annual emissions, but we will keep on emitting all the way till 2050. And hopefully by 2050, we'll be down to net zero. But in the meantime, we're going to keep on emitting. This is actually a license to keep putting more greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. And what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that is that climate change is really about cumulative emissions, not annual emissions. Here's what I mean by that. David McLaughlin, who's a recognized Canadian policy expert, proposed a climate strategy for the Conservative Party of Canada that was published in an article recently on thehub.ca, linked down below in the description. And it focuses on cumulative emissions reductions as the key to meaningful climate action. Okay, now the proposal makes an interesting argument to shift our focus away from what we don't want, which is annual carbon emissions. We don't want that. To what we do want, reducing the growing cumulative emission burden. He used this Wayne Gretzky quote, "This is skating to where the puck is going."
Fires up the center. Here's Gretzky, 5 minutes left. Gretzky with Lemieux. Pass to Lemieux.
Right? McLaughlin makes the point that climate change is generated by the cumulative effect of carbon gathering in the atmosphere from decades of previous pollution. And he argues that a focus on how we can reduce future net emissions will be more effective than focusing on continuing to emit them. This approach still supports working towards a net zero trajectory, but what it does, here's a couple of things that are really creative about it that will actually make an immediate impact. It encourages domestic clean technology solutions like carbon capture to draw the carbon that's already in the atmosphere back out. Secondly, it incorporates natural carbon options like maintaining and protecting our wetlands, or maybe even recovering them, or big carbon sinks like grasslands. So instead of setting targets for emissions, like we're doing under COP29, reduce GHG emissions by 40% by 2050 or something like that, focus on the immediate cumulative carbon emission reduction and measure it, set the targets for and measure it in 5-year increments. That's a fast approaching deadline. This goal of achieve something in 2.5 decades, well, we can sit around on our hands for a long time before we're even close to that. But if you put in a 5-year incremental, fast approaching deadline with an incentive, now we're going to get some action. If we provide a financial incentive to make money and clean up the atmosphere and reduce the cumulative emissions long term, now we're making a direct impact instead of just sitting on a slow decline and continuing to emit. So David suggests providing provinces, this is for Canada again, with targeted financial supports refreshed every 5 years if they meet their target. And another interesting thing about this is a one-size-fits-all approach to climate change policy and reducing emissions just doesn't work. There's just too much variability in different places in the world. So this focuses on bringing down cumulative aggregate emissions that are in the atmosphere and allows countries or communities or companies that are operating in different parts of the world to capitalize on those regional differences and do stuff that makes sense there instead of coming up with some grand plan that's supposed to work everywhere equally on the planet, which won't work. Now, interesting fact, did you know that Canada, who purports to be very interested in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and working on climate change, Canada has never achieved a UN climate target since that Kyoto Protocol was signed? I'm not sure this business as usual thing is working. I'll put a link to David's report down in the description of the video. I often talk about this with my clients and the students at the Ravenwater Learning Circle about focusing and planning for what we don't want, the harm and the pain, instead of what we do want, which is eliminating that. So when we have this continuing another 2 or 3 decades of emitting, we're hoping we're just going to mitigate the pain. One of the ways that's being offered is for the big emitter countries to give money to the low emitter countries. Well, mitigation, here's the definition from dictionary.com of mitigate: to lessen in force or intensity as wrath, grief, harshness, or pain. That's what mitigation is, just to lessen it a little bit. So really, we got to think about this. If we're going to continue on this trajectory of emitting, what's our pain goal? How much pain do we want to have? I say, let's not do that. Let's not set a pain goal. Instead, let's focus on what we do want, which is eliminating cumulative emissions in the atmosphere. Okay? Now, annual greenhouse gas emissions that are here today that go up in the atmosphere this year, they're going to continue to drive climate forcing decades into the future. It's not just for today. What we do today is going to pile on. It's like a positive feedback loop into the future. Take a look at this graph. Most of the emissions that we release today will still be heating the planet 2 generations from now. In another science article by scientist Alan Pears, and I'll put that link in the description as well, it highlights this critical issue of how the current focus on annual carbon emissions and 100-year global warming potentials is really misleading and counterproductive to addressing the climate crisis. And so Alan is a prominent Australian energy efficiency expert with a distinguished career spanning 4 decades. He knows what he's talking about. The article emphasizes that it's the cumulative concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere rather than just the annual emissions that drives global heating. So every ton of emission adds to the global heating process. And the longer it's in the atmosphere, the bigger the cumulative impact. It's a self-reinforcing system. So we've got a strong focus on reducing annual emissions to a target based on a trajectory of progressive reduction and eventually getting to net zero by 2050. But as Pears notes in his article, this ignores the reality that it is the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and their contribution to radiative forcing in real time that actually drives global heating. In Alan's article, he points out that he was talking with some young students recently and told them that many of the emissions that we're releasing today will still be heating the planet when those kids are grown up and they have kids of their own. You can see that feedback loop in the graph that I just showed. So there's another thing. We're very focused on CO2 emissions, but it's not the only greenhouse gas out there. In fact, there are other greenhouse gases that are in lower concentrations than carbon dioxide, but are far more potent. I think that methane is about 20 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. Over the last decade, more than half of all of the global heating driven by greenhouse gas concentration has been from methane. I'll put the link to that article in the description below. So let's stop focusing on our pain goal, what we don't want, and how we might lessen or mitigate. Instead, focus on the thing that is driving the system, which is cumulative buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Allow us to work on other things besides reducing emissions like carbon sequestration and carbon capture. That'd be a lot more efficient and get us there a lot faster with a lot less pain. Now, what could you do as an individual? Because these are like big scale things, right? They're big, huge government type efforts. But as an individual, we can also contribute. Here's a couple of ways that we could reduce our own GHG forcings. GHG forcings, that's another video, which I'll add. 2 easy ways we can reduce our greenhouse gas forcings and probably save ourselves some money too. Number 1, we reduce our individual consumption of energy, which will reduce our overall emissions. For example, it's estimated that turning your thermostat down 3 degrees Fahrenheit, if you're in metric, that's 1.7 degrees Celsius. If you turn down your thermostat in the winter by that much, and then up 3 degrees Fahrenheit in the summer, that'll reduce our carbon dioxide emissions by over 1,000 pounds a year, which translates to about 476 kilograms per year. So even better, to make this even better, if we use a programmable thermostat, I've been using one for years, it's awesome, you can automatically lower your monthly energy bill by giving your heat and your air conditioning a break while you're either asleep or you're away. Reduce your emissions, don't have to do anything, the thermostat does it for you, and have more money in your pocket. That sounds like a good one. The other way that I suggest we all as individuals could reduce our emissions is to vote with our wallet. Do everything that we reasonably can not to participate in linear economies that deplete. Instead of that, support local production. Reduce your personal consumption of single-use products, and do that by reducing how many of them you purchase. That's a direct signal to the market about our consumer preference. And you better believe it, producers listen to that. What do you think about climate change policy and action? What do you think about this concept of cumulative emissions versus driving a future target of pain and continuing to emit for another 2.5 decades? Leave your thoughts below. I really want to hear it. Sharing information out to a large audience is going to help us drive positive change. So please do your part. Hit subscribe, hit like, and share this video with somebody else you care about. Until the next time, remember, everything is connected.